Alright, so this is my culturally responsive teaching portfolio, or better known as my CRTP, that I made for this class over the course of the summer, starting from week 1 all the way to week 5. So week 1 asked the question of who are today's students? So the first task that we did was the self-reflection, in which we discussed the levels of culture by reading Zaretta Hammond's Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. We discussed surface culture, shallow culture, and deep culture, and kind of talking about how, these sort of aspects that Zaretta talks about can apply to our own views of culture. So this was posted on the Padlet. I talked a lot about my personal experiences with holidays and food, as well as normal things such as being late to stuff or spending time outside. So I also at the end discussed a lot of growing up in American culture. So basically the larger sphere of culture that has influenced me, as opposed to the smaller sphere is family influence. And I talked about the meaning of culture. So I said, in my opinion, culture is the blueprint for the way we navigate life and the world around us. Not only are we products of our microenvironment, our immediate family, but I believe we are also the product of our our macro environment, which is our law, society, technological advancements. And culture is a blueprint for us, but it's also not intrinsic, and it's the part of us that are taught. And levels of culture, I highly agree with the reading and I really enjoyed her analogy for culture as a tree, talking about the roots, the tree itself, as well as the leaves, to understand the different levels of culture. And we also discussed the cultural categories. So this is race and ethnicity, language, socioeconomic status, disability, religion, immigration experience, and gender and sexuality. So these are different categories that I said allow us to implement culturally sensitive teaching. Rather than putting students in boxes and stereotypes, we can use these categories to better connect with students. We also, during week 1, discussed America's changing demographics and how that, things have changed a lot over time, and they contribute to greater cultural diversity in classrooms. And many different terms have become politically charged over time, and most of the time in a negative connotation. And students of color now make up more than half of the public school population in the U.S., which was a fact that I found very interesting. And I just added some more of the graphs in here, specifically things that had to do with in relation to Pennsylvania, because that's where we go to school, that's where I live, where I intend on teaching. So things that could put things in perspective for me a little bit, and that would be more pertinent to me as a future educator. So jumping now into week 2, the question that we were asked or kind of prompted was, who am I as a future teacher? So we first watched the video, Where Are You From? And I remember this video, it was very interesting. It was very short, but it offered a very interesting perspective. And I believe that if someone were to watch that, being possibly from the perspective of the man, that they could see how certain things can come off as offensive. So the question was, what assumptions does the man make? So the man assumes that she was from a foreign country, or assuming she didn't speak English, or English wasn't her first language. He also made the assumption she likes certain foods such as kimchi or Korean barbecue. And he made those assumptions based on her race or her outward features, not even really knowing anything about her at all. And in the video, the context was that they were absolute strangers. How do the questions affect the person being asked? I said the woman felt stereotyped and visibly annoyed and offended as questions, and rightfully so. Asking questions like the one the man does stereotypes people and puts them in a box and doesn't take account their interests, hobbies, or personalities. And I haven't really experienced something, I would say, to the extent of that the woman did. I kind of talked about I've had people ask me and what I am, or assuming that I'm Italian or Latina, but I am neither of those things, simply based on my outward appearance. But But these were people that I think the context is very important, from my experiences to the video, where that was asked by somebody who was a close friend of mine. She was genuinely curious, as opposed to a stranger just outwardly saying that is offensive, and a highly different experience to what I went through. So in week 2, the second thing we did was we watched the TED Talk, and in which she discussed about single stories and kind of the dangers with that. So I said, when we learn about a group through only one source, like news broadcasts, social media, or limited history books, we apply one situation to an entire group of people, reducing real, unique humans to just one example. And I talk a lot about how I think the media nowadays portrays like certain groups of people within context of like very negative contexts as a way to fearmonger and further isolate these groups of people from the rest of society, which is obviously incredibly wrong. And I think that that's something that is going on in our society and something that has continued throughout history. I said, how might those perceptions or expectations influence your interactions with students, families, or colleagues? I said, in an educational setting, harboring a single story can deeply impact classroom relationships in a negative way. If a teacher has a limited view of students from marginalized or low-income backgrounds, they might lower their expectations of the students' capabilities. If a teacher assumes a family does not care about education because they do not attend PTA meetings or speak English fluently, the teacher closes the door to a genuine relationship with the parent and the child. Both of them. And the same can be said for colleagues as well. Assuming things about coworkers based on race, ethnicity, economic status also ends up closing that door to building a safe and positive relationship. And I think something that I really took away from the video was just closed-mindedness, and how like that really, it's just a detriment to the person who has a closed mind, because they're going to miss out on so many like amazing and wonderful different perspectives that they had the opportunity to possibly learn, but are choosing instead to go with a closed-minded attitude. What is your biggest takeaway from the video? I said that stereotypes are dangerous, not only because they're completely made up, but because they don't look at the whole picture. They strip away the nuance and diversity of human life, making one single, most times false, narrative the entire truth. The concepts in the video have made me question certain narratives or stereotypes that might be pushed onto me in my life or in society that we're all susceptible to. Just as Adichie admitted she fell into the single story of Mexican immigrants due to U.S. media coverage, only to be corrected when she visited Guadalajara and saw people laughing, working, and living normal lives. A third thing we did on week 2 was do core components. So these were 2 concepts that really shine throughout both videos, which is cultural lens and implicit bias or stereotypes. So I said cultural lens is the way that people view the world through the context that they were born into. This can be someone being born into a Catholic family who's lower class and resides in New York City. That individual will approach their life using the cultural lens that they were born into. And implicit biases are things that are in general society and culture, and that a lot of media perpetuates negative stereotypes of people from various different backgrounds, and these stereotypes permeate the public's view of people. Implicit also furthers this because the way the media creates the stereotypes, but oftentimes doesn't even realize it. So a lot of times I believe that the media really perpetuates certain stereotypes, and to the public or the viewer, it's very like covert. It's not very obvious that that's happening, but like you can see as, you keep being fed certain perspectives, like negative or incriminating perspectives, that becomes like your worldview. We also learned about the 3 Ps, which are positionality, privilege, and power. And I also put what's it called? The circle, the ranges, kind of, or like the different shades, or more depths of these different concepts. Sometimes someone's location on the wheel can influence perspectives, assumptions, and interactions with students and families from different backgrounds. And all these factors contribute to how a student can be treated in a classroom or the way they approach the world. And opportunity gap was something else we learned about, which is something that a child is born into. They don't have a choice into this, And someone born into a wealthy family is more likely to have more opportunity than someone even in the same classroom as them, because they might have access to more resources. So within week 3, the big question that really guided us this week was, how do culture and equity shape learning? And some key concepts within this week were systematic oppression, microaggressions, and brain and culture. So kind of delving into the science of it. So the first thing we learned about during week 3 was the 6 isms, which is racism, sexism, classism, ageism, heterosexism, and ableism. So I personally I think that this visual is a very easy way to see these different groups and understand the categories. And the second thing we did in week 3 was we watched the systematic oppression video reactions. So this was a video that talked about a lot of the systematic oppressions in our society and how those actually begin within the education system. So I said, how do these examples of systematic oppression affect students' educational experiences, opportunities, and sense of belonging in schools? I said Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than white students. While white students are normally suspended for objective infractions like smoking, Black students are punished for subjective behaviors like talking back or insubordination. This creates an environment that makes it so Black students might feel at the bottom of the food chain, or that school is not a safe or fair place for them. When the basic needs of safety and trust in a learning environment is not established, then students are unable to do the thing they come to school for, which is to learn. And as a future teacher, it asks how we can minimize this within our classrooms in our school. And I said setting clear and objective rules that apply to everyone that the students are able to come up with themselves. And certain relationships and personal connections with students, though, can be more equitable, providing more one-on-one emotional talks about basic behaviors such as respect, emotional control, etc. to students who might not be getting that guidance at home, rather than, in kind of speaking to that point in the last sentence, I believe that rather than, especially for very subjective infractions like that was discussed on this slide, like talking back or insubordination, that sometimes can be a result of that not being taught at home or somebody's home life. Like we talked about positionality, power, like maybe they or were not in a place where that was, they had to focus on other things in their household rather than learning things like that. So I don't believe that that's something that children should be punished for, but something that can, possibly be a learning opportunity for them. The third thing we talked about this week was microaggressions. These are subtle, everyday verbal and nonverbal slights, snubs, or insults which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to people of color based solely on their marginalized group membership. So this visual also gives a lot of good examples, like I don't see color, your English is so good, where did you learn it, can I touch your hair, you people are all the same, like very harmful comments that people sometimes don't even realize that they're making, but they can be extremely detrimental to somebody's self-confidence or just how their own personal view. And then the fourth thing we talked about was racial trauma and its outcomes. So the definition of racial trauma is the cumulative microaggressive forms of racism that result in emotional, physical, psychological, and mental injury caused by lifelong encounters with racial discrimination. And within the reading, something that I noticed was that they stated that observed in numerous underrepresented communities and people of all ages, including young children. So this just affects everybody. It is not specific to one group. And it's also stated that if it's not treated, addressed, or confronted, that it can result in stress-related conditions such as low self-worth, anxiety, social withdrawal, or even, in extreme cases, depression and most likely mental illness. So, as well as inequalities in education. The fifth thing we kind of discussed was solution to systematic oppression. So how can you as a future teacher challenge systematic stereotypes? I said a great way teachers can do this is to not focus on the outward appearance of a child or take them only at face value. Digging deeper and prioritizing genuine connections is something that can bridge the inequality gap that is created by certain stereotypes. And what dispositions are essential for educators committed to equity and social justice? I said one important factor could be promoting and encouraging a sharing of culture and values. Many times in elementary school, my fellow classmates had their parents come in and share their own cultural traditions, such as Chinese New Year. It really taught me a lot about other perspectives. So that is something that I was very fortunate to have growing up. I remember one time in, I believe, third grade or first grade, I believe it was third grade, like we had many students in my class who celebrated Chinese New Year, and their parents were able to come in, and like the student was able to talk about, my classmate was able to talk about their experiences with Chinese New Year, like, and the specific traditions that they follow, as well as just, certain other, traditions that are just general, and like with the red envelopes and like the concepts of luck and all that. And I clearly still remember it to this day, and I remember even as a kid just thinking it was very cool to learn about, because oftentimes I think that if teachers are too hyper-focused on curriculum and this and that you're losing like genuine cultural education. And I believe cultural education is so important, because like I said, my own experiences with that were extremely positive and something that I've carried with me. Like I know certain things that, maybe other people didn't get an opportunity to know, because I was able to be educated in the classroom at a young age and exposed to different cultures. So this was my reading reflection for week 3. Based on the same reading, the Zaretta Hammonds. And basically, a lot of the information here was discussed a lot about microaggressions and, certain groups of people, and like possibly, what microaggressions are commonly directed towards them. And we also I did discuss a little bit about the scientific aspects of microaggressions and how there is like a true science behind these things. And I think a lot of times, if a teacher has never faced microaggressions in their experience, and it's never been something directed towards them, it's hard for them to put themselves in the shoes of somebody who has, because I'm sure it's it's clearly an upsetting experience that puts your brain in fight or flight, and they just don't, they're like, oh, they just need to stop being so sensitive, while they're, especially discussed in this article, there really is like a science behind, it being a traumatic experience that can be really reductive to the school experience and the learning experience as a whole. So then moving on to week 4, the question was, how can teachers expand learning opportunities for every student? And a lot of key concepts were building trust, learning partnerships, and rapport, alliance, and affirmation. So this was based on the power of relationships in schools, that video, and this was the reflection on that. So something I noticed instantly when watching the video was the language that teachers use when talking to the students. They use language that is uplifting and shows that the teacher has expectations of them, but in a non-pressuring way. Rather than becoming patronizing when a student seems off, they also care about their well-being. As exemplified in the video, prioritizing students' emotional security and safety over being strict can help break down walls so the students can feel safe in the classroom. That sense of trust gives them the ability to push through hard academic challenges. For me, this video is perfectly representative of how teaching isn't just about sticking to the curriculum. It's about building a supportive, consistent community where every student feels seen and safe, which can help them develop a genuine connection with education and school. So this video also really stuck with me. One of the students in the video that was interviewed, like, he was being asked, he was just talking about how, he never really had positive experiences with school, but, having a teacher who cares can really make a difference. And they showed a clip of the teacher coming up to him, like, saying, like, hey, what's going on? And she used, like, very specific language that was, like, uplifting and being like, hey, not saying, like, I expect more of you, like, in a negative way, but, like, saying, like, hey, what's going on? Like, how can we work through this together? And I just think, like, building that partnership and relationship and making students feel like they're not alone through this, through their school experience, especially if they've had negative experiences in the past, is really important. And now here's our second thing we did was talk a little bit more about the science of it all. So the neurobiological layer, the amygdala, hijack, and trust. So the basics of this is that it breaks down the brain mechanics of learning and explains how cultural alienation or threats activate the amygdala, freezing the prefrontal cortex, and how intentionally gained trust serves as the neurobiological antidote by releasing oxygen to free up cognitive bandwidth. So very jibber-jabbery here, but essentially how, like, once again, as I stated previously, like, a genuine connection and trust with students there is a biological and scientific release of oxytocin, which is the emotion released, from relationships and positive relationships, and that building that security is so important. Then the interpersonal layer, which is validation and affirmation. So this analyzes how validation respects a student's lived cultural realities, while affirmation builds intellectual self-efficacy by honoring their identity as an asset and maintaining high academic expectations. So to break that down a little bit more, validation, and when I say validation and like what I believe it means is just basically showing genuine care and like, asking a student about their lives validates their, feeling just as a human being, like someone's interested, somebody cares about them, and it validates who they are, which builds self-confidence, and that also in turn builds that self-efficacy and, making them feel confident, which makes them, more productive. And the pedagogical layer, which is rapport and alliance, unpacks how rapport is actively built via a pedagogy of listening and positive nonverbal communication, which is nonverbal communication takes up 70% of human interaction, it was an extremely interesting fact to learn. And it also explains how alliance transitions this cozy emotional warmth into a strict coaching pact geared towards student growth. So also what I mean by that is, like, rapport and relationships are extremely, once again, important. And especially, like, what I believe, especially with the nonverbal communication, is that a teacher, if they pretend to be interested in their students, they don't really care, they're just asking because they feel like they're obligated to or they have to, that child will feel that through that nonverbal communication. And I believe that can also be detrimental and embarrassing for the student. And I think, like, that just, once again, it all comes back to the same sort of thing, that just really at the heart of it all, just showing genuine care for students and really wanting to be there and wanting to make those connections so that they have positive experiences is one of the most integral components of becoming a teacher, and one of the most important things that I definitely think that this class has reinstated to me. And lastly, synergy and academic risk-taking. So, okay. Specifically, Hammond talks about the equation that rapport and alliance equals cognitive insight. So it traces the path of a student moving from a survival state to establishing a trust baseline. So, once again, which allows them to enter a coaching partnership and developing the neurobiological courage to take massive academic risks, just sharing unpolished work or pushing through errors. So that's something that is also it's very common, I believe, in school settings. Like, I felt this way, and I'm sure many other people have felt this way. Just like, if you're not good at something, you just want to give up. Or sometimes students will say, like, I don't want to do this. I'm not good at it. They just want to. They just shut down. And I believe that Hammond, like, she really does a wonderful job of touching on, like, the neurological reasons behind this, and how. But on the other hand of that, how a coaching partnership is able to help the students get past that. And, when they have that support, then they are able to, like I said, take those big academic risks and just be more confident, which goes back to what stated here with the self-efficacy and, just like confidence overall as a student. Now, this was the warm demander. So this was when we watched the warm demander pedagogy video. And so the definition of a warm demander is, to me, a warm demander is an educator who combines a safe, predictable, and structured environment while being kind, caring, and focusing on meaningful relationships. This position as a teacher requires actively building personal relationships and trust with students first over everything. Once that safe emotional base is set, the teacher can then use that trust to push students into their zone of proximal development. A lot of what I've learned in this class is that without laying the foundation of respect, the students are unable to learn and get the most out of school that they can. So this goes a lot with what I was saying to these slides with the building learning partnerships is, students and teachers are a team, and that without that foundation of respect and, security, then students are unable, they are neurobiologically unable to just function or, get the most out of their learning experience. So these are the four different comparisons of a warm demander versus, so it's all on the scale of warmth and demandingness. So the warm demander falls on high warmth as well as high demandingness. So focuses explicitly on building rapport and relational trust, holds high standards while providing intentional instructional scaffolding. So like I said, the zone of proximal development, like I said in the last slide, and encourages productive struggle to grow independent learners. While the technocrat is low warmth and high demandingness, has no focus on building student relationships and holds high standards, but only on technical competence, such as grades and other things like that. Supports independent learners well, but leaves dependent learners behind. And there's a sentimentalist, which is high warmth and low demandingness. So focus heavily on building relationships and showing affection. Lowers expectations out of pity or misplaced sympathy. So that also goes into a dangerous category with the, with possible biases, where if a teacher just says, well, for an example, if a student is bilingual or maybe English isn't their first language, they assume that they are not intelligent or capable, and that misplaced sympathy really is detrimental to the child's actual learning and limits their capabilities. So then the elitist is low warmth and low demandingness. So they keep a cold professional distance from diverse students and organizes instruction exclusively around students who are already independent and treats different cultural learning styles as negative. So definitely a very closed-minded sort of teacher, and similar to the technocrat, they prioritize students who are independent. So my reflection on this is being a warm demander completely changes how students learn. When students feel safe, any things they might be experiencing out of the classroom can disappear. This emotional safety gives them the ability to maximize their experience at school emotionally and educationally. They stop feeling alone and start building real confidence in the things they do. Ultimately, high yet kind expectations show them it shows the students that their teacher truly believes in them. So lastly, jumping into week 5, the big question that was discussed was, who do I want to become as a teacher? So this was the first thing we did in this week, which was the asset-based approach to teaching, the video as well as the article. So I said, with using an asset-based approach, it helped teachers to see their students for what they already bring to the table, and how their cultural backgrounds, life experiences, and existing skills can all contribute something to the classroom, rather than just focusing on where they're falling short. A good way to apply this is to use their current strengths as a foundation to help them learn new and challenging concepts. As the article suggests, a good way to implement this in classroom means starting with low-stakes diagnostic activities to spot where the student is already good at, and then setting up different learning paths so every kid can hit their goals, all the while catering to their different levels of understanding. So once again, going back to the zone of proximal development, I believe that is also something that I'm finding to be a common theme with the warm demander as well as the asset-based approach, is something that these sort of teachers, and ideally the one that I would become, really use. And that's something that I've, a term, obviously, zone of proximal development in child psych. So teachers can also tailor their feedback so that they're celebrating what they've learned first before giving them clear, actionable steps on how to grow. Ultimately, when using an asset-based approach, it shows students that we truly believe in them, which builds up their confidence and gets them excited to continue learning. So this was a revisiting of our student portraits. This was through the Purdue website and an activity we did in week 4. And then this was when we revisited them and kind of used the knowledge that the asset-based approach kind of gave us a little bit more insight into. So what linguistic, cultural, family, or personal assets does a student bring to the table, the classroom? So I chose a girl named Erin. She's in kindergarten, and these were some different assets that I noticed from her portrait. So she's bilingual, and she does chores and work at home, and she's supportive parents, and she's a caring big sister. So being bilingual, Erin is already learning to read at home in Spanish. This skill will help her learn to read in English faster since she already understands the basic processes of reading. She also hears 2 languages, already activating a larger vocabulary for herself. And chores and working at home, Erin cooks and cleans with her parents, giving her real-life experience with things such as counting, measuring, and sorting. She's also used to being helpful and contributing to community outside of herself. Supportive parents. Her parents have good jobs and care deeply about reading, giving her a great learning environment at home. And she's a caring big sister, and she's a proud family member. She's excited to help care for her new baby sister. This shows she's responsible and works well with others and is working hard to be thoughtful and supportive person. So, moving beyond deficit thinking, this was very interesting because it put us in the perspective of, okay, if a teacher was using the deficit thinking, that bias way of thinking, how they might view her, and putting us in those shoes. And then reframing that assumption using an asset-based one. So viewing students, their different skills as an asset to the classroom rather than a deficit, which is a negative. So a teacher might assume that because Erin comes from a home where Spanish is the dominant language and is at a WIDA level 2, she's behind, quote unquote, behind her peers or unable to complete challenging classwork. Instead of seeing a language limit, the teacher should recognize Erin's trait of being bilingual for the positives that come with it, such as already understanding certain aspects of English from having learned it later. She already has reading skills in Spanish and a rich background in the previously mentioned skills, such as measuring, counting, etc., in math and science through cooking at home. So this was my final reflection that I did this week. So what do you think is the most important disposition that teachers should cultivate, and why do you think this is important? I think the most important disposition a teacher can have is the warm demander disposition. I believe when worth, kindness, thoughtfulness, and genuine care is combined with a stable, fair, predictable, and reliable force, which is the teacher, students are able to truly thrive in a classroom environment. I've learned in child psych classes that stability for children and predictability, especially predictability, can help children feel safe. And as we've learned in this course, the science behind the importance of safety in the classroom so students can actually learn. A reference to the fight or flight with the amygdala and everything that was especially discussed in Hammond's articles. How do you plan to apply this disposition in your future teaching practice? So my first example was our classroom rules will be dictated by the class itself, with teacher guidance, of course, on one of the first days of school. This will allow students to feel a sense of choice over their own class rules and a sense of responsibility as well, making them feel more like they belong, all while still having the stability of structured rules. And then my second example is another way I can do this is to provide scaffolding. Oftentimes students feel like they are incapable of doing work and simply refuse to do it. So this is kind of something I mentioned earlier in the video and earlier in my CRTP. Is like students just shutting down and just thinking that they are unable to complete a task when the teacher knows that they are more than capable. I will make it a standard in my classroom that I don't accept work that shows no effort, but I provide the exact tools, steps, and emotional reassurance the student needs to reach that standard. An example of this is if a student submits an incomplete assignment and says, I can't do this. A good response from a warm demander, so this would be like an ideal response that I would try to implement using the warm demander blueprint kind of, would be to establish connection by relating to them that there are things that are hard for them too, even as the teacher. Next, the teacher can say, let's do it together and work side by side with the student and help direct them in the right direction, so going back to the zone of proximal development. So that is all I have for my CRTP. I really enjoyed this class, and I definitely think that making the CRTP is it's like basically a great way just to keep notes that, especially on a digital copy, that I can reference back to, possibly in the future. And overall, I think that the CRTP was a great way for me to really like deepen my like I could always just read the articles and watch the videos and then just get a surface level understanding, but I really believe that the CRTP allowed me to really reflect on those thoughts a little bit more and really, think actively on how this would apply in a classroom rather than just being like, oh, here, this video discusses cultural biases, this really stinks, like here are some examples of cultural biases. But then the CRTP really allowed me to analyze how like those biases are in our culture, but really how that culture like parlays into the classroom and how that really affects it. So thank you so much for a wonderful summer. Thank you.